So now this is our last part of part 3 of Gospel Grounded Ministry to Sexual Minorities in the Church. And this part of our Transcending the Binary, the false binary of pride and shame, we are going to discuss acceptance. Okay, so again, as we said, 3.4, acceptance. This is the conclusion of our presentation here on these false binaries. And another way to think of restoration sexuality, or remember at the top of the pyramid, we had at the bottom, of course, pride and shame. And at the top, we have gratitude or humility. And another word we could put up there at the top is acceptance. But this is not acceptance.
I love it.
A better way to start thinking about it is, I think most people are familiar with these 5 stages of grief. And this is more where we're at. And acceptance is just, as Dan has in his a theme of many of these presentations, our acceptance of, and then our response to our circumstances, whatever they are. You know, in the stage of grief, it's often death. But here, acceptance doesn't mean people don't reject me. People are still going to reject you, especially if you're Christian. Jesus was pretty clear that if you're a disciple of Christ, the world is not going to accept you.
Right.
It's a fool's errand. It also doesn't mean you're supposed to be okay with whatever yucky stuff is in your life, internally or externally. It doesn't mean you're okay with people doing terrible things to you. It doesn't mean pretending that painful things don't hurt. It doesn't mean you have to give yourself a pep talk and plaster on a smile when things aren't smile-worthy.
Right.
So what is it if that's what it isn't?
It's a lot of letting go.
It's really a lot of letting go. If you've done any 12-step work, this is surrender.
Yeah, absolutely. You're letting go a lot of coping mechanisms and a lot of tendencies and instincts that we have. Acceptance is letting go of a lot of things.
I was at a seminar just yesterday, and the presenter said something I really liked. He said, self-care is not pampering yourself so you can survive your crappy life.
Right.
This is the same thing. Acceptance is not all these things so that you can do it. It is coming to a place of peace, because we can only move forward from where we're at.
Yep.
There's a great way to know you can do acceptance if you can just redirect yourself to this sentence. My present reality is ... Fill in the blank.
One thing
that's all it is.
Yeah. And one thing that I tell people who are struggling in their faith, and people who have lost their faith, you know, there are some people who have just lost their convictions about the gospel for whatever reason. And something that I say, and it might sound a little bit controversial, but I say something that can be helpful to you is to vocalize what has happened and actually say it out loud and say, I no longer believe in blank gospel concept. And say that, and you'll feel grief as you say it. You'll feel something difficult as you say it. You might even break down in tears as you say it. But then just sit there and pause, and you'll notice that you were not struck by lightning from heaven when you said that, right? You say it, and you know that this is your present reality. And with that honesty, you can actually sense God's love in the midst of that. And you don't have to worry, oh, you know, God hates me for doubting this gospel concept. You don't have to worry about any of those things. You can, once you actually go through that step of acceptance and say, this is my reality, there's something that that happens that's really wonderful. And now, but I'm talking about saying that without pride, right?
My present reality is, well, and pride will have superlatives in the rest of that sentence, or so like my present reality is I'll never get married.
Right.
Certainly a better statement in acceptance would be my present reality is I'm not ready to date.
Right.
I'm not in a position to be dating.
Yeah.
That's the great example of acceptance, right?
That's a beautiful acceptance statement.
Mm-hmm.
And for faith struggles, you might say, instead of saying, my present reality is that I've realized the gospel isn't true. No, you haven't. That's not acceptance. Acceptance is saying, my present reality is I do not feel like I any longer have confidence in this gospel concept, and I don't quite know what to do about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then just breathe.
Yeah.
And just be okay. And notice again that you weren't struck by lightning when you said that.
My present
God still loves you.
My present reality is I'm navigating a painful contradiction between my sexual and romantic desires, goals, dreams, and gospel teaching, current gospel teaching. Yeah. Right. That's for some people at certain times, that is definitely very, very painful. And I don't know how to resolve that right now. Right. Those are, that's again, a great place of acceptance.
Yeah. And you can say something like that without any judgment, without having to try to make it better.
And I'm a bad person, or the church isn't true, or the first presidency hates me, or whatever.
Right. You don't have to employ any of those mechanisms, right? Those instinctive responses to the statement. Just let the statement go and just breathe and be okay, right? There's something really wonderful about that kind of honesty, but it's honesty that doesn't have the drama and these other elements that we often bring in.
Woe is me. It's bad enough without doing that to ourselves.
Right.
Or others.
Right.
Well, we're going to drag some Buddhism in here, thanks to Dan.
Yes.
Don't freak out.
Right.
This is all compatible with the gospel, but some wonderful concepts. The 3 poisons.
Yes, the 3 poisons are super valuable. And I actually sometimes, like when I give talks in church, I warn people, hey, I'm about to teach you a little bit of Buddhism. And and brace yourselves. And when I teach the 3 poisons, it's really cool to see what happens. You know, a lot of people, it's kind of a breakthrough for them, like it has been for me. But in Buddhist psychology, what they say is these are things that increase our suffering
unnecessarily.
Yes. A lot of our suffering in life, in fact, maybe most, according to a lot of Buddhists, is self-generated. It's suffering that we
which
create.
Is, again, painful part of acceptance sometimes. That, yes, our lives may have sucked, but we made them suck more. And maybe we really put ourselves over the edge. Right. Again, we don't want to blame the victim. We're not saying your circumstances are really wonderful and you just can't see it. That's not what we're saying here.
Right.
We are saying the ways we think about our circumstances make them even more difficult.
Yes, absolutely.
And that may be, we're just suggesting this, try it on for size, but certainly from my experience, I can absolutely attest to what Dan says. In my experience, the majority of my suffering was self-generated. Not all of it, but if I let myself get hung up on this, I could really get sad. But this is part of acceptance too. Yes, I created a lot of this anguish for myself, and hopefully I'm moving forward and not going to add any more of these poisons than I need to.
Right. So we have attachment, aversion, and delusion. These are the 3 poisons of Buddhism. And attachment is when you crave for things to be a certain way, or you insist that something needs to happen in order for you to be happy. Aversion is the opposite. It's where you you think, oh, I can only be happy if something doesn't happen. This thing that I don't like I need that to not happen in order for me to be happy. And then delusion is when you just simply refuse to accept reality. Reality is difficult, and we say that a lot. And so delusion is a mechanism of, we daydream and we employ these mental processes that just kind of remove us from reality. So as an example of this, I say, imagine if I went to church and I said, okay, I'm about to walk in the doors of church. I need there to be a really good talk on tithing, because that's my favorite issue. And I need that in order to be happy at church today.
Or I prayed for there to be a talk about that. And so if God is there and answering my prayers, this is the way he needs to answer it today.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I've developed an attachment to that idea. All right. It's an expectation. It's a craving. And now let's say I have some aversions, I need for certain people to not look at me. I don't want them to look at me at all. Okay. Because I'm averse to their gaze. Right. And I need for there to not be a kid running up and down the hall because, oh man, I can't stand that. So I've got all these aversions, these things that I hate, right, that happen at church. And I can only be happy at church if those things don't happen. And then there's delusion, where it's like, okay, I'm going to walk into church and there are going to be some amazing things that happen. And, you just kind of build this fictional idea of what's going to happen because you can't handle the reality. So the more of those things that we have, the more likely it is that we're going to be miserable walking in the doors of church. The more likely it is that we're going to leave those meetings like, oh, that was horrible. Right.
And the antidote to all three of these poisons is the same, right? Acceptance.
Yep.
And openness to experience. We'll get to that in our later slides. I'm jumping the gun here.
No, but it's valuable because Jeff said that at the top of the triangle, when you transcend pride and shame, you've got humility and you can put acceptance there. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of the same thing in this scenario that I'm talking about, like walking into church. What if I walked into church and I walked in the doors and I said, I don't know what's going to happen at church today. Reality is going to be whatever it's going to be. But I trust God.
And I'm here for a reason.
Yeah.
And let me see if I can see what that is. And it may be something we receive or something we give or both.
Right. I'm going to walk in the doors. Maybe somebody just needs a kind word from me. Mm-hmm. How amazing would it be if I could just offer a kind word and make somebody's day? Mm-hmm. Maybe there's an opportunity to learn something. And what if you just walk in the doors with that kind of an open heart? Mm-hmm. And you say, some people might do things that irritate me. It's okay. I'm not going to be rattled by that. And just real quickly, I mean, if you think about how these things apply to General Conference, for example, imagine if you surround yourself with people who are saying, oh, this thing needs to happen at General Conference in order to have a good experience, or some things need to not happen in order for me to have a good experience, or there's going to be some huge announcement. That's a delusion, right? Right. There's this announcement of this thing that I've been yearning for ages. And imagine you go to every General Conference with the three poisons, right? Generating your own bad experience of General Conference instead of saying, General Conference is going to be what it's going to be. And I have choices about how I respond to that. I have choices about how I engage with it, whether those are healthy engagement patterns or not.
Right. So how does this apply to sexual minorities? I think we'll start with attachment. I think sometimes we can become overly attached to our identity. I don't know anybody listening, so I'm not going to, make any blanket statements here, but I'm going to ask all of you to consider if it's possible some of our experiences have defined it. Mark Yarhouse, that we'll talk a lot more about him in part 4, but Mark Yarhouse identifies sexual orientation. I really like his definition of sexual orientation, which is just simply the history of your attractions. And attachment would say that that also is going to define how we experience things in the future, that therefore it is always going to be. An aversion would say, oh my gosh, I can't have these same-sex feelings. I can't have these same-sex erotic feelings. Oh no, what if I do? Or aversion could look like, I can't handle it if church leaders make certain statements. I'm averse to hearing certain things about my identity, or people don't accept my identity, or people might think I'm gay and I can't have people think I'm gay. It can go either way, depending on where we're at. And delusion, I just would again invite you to consider, are all the things you believe about yourself related to your sexuality actually true? Particularly when we talk about the deep past, your early childhood, how those formative experiences may have formed your experiences, your pre-existence, and then, of course, later in mortality and in the eternities. Do you have a true view of that? Have you interpreted the spiritual experiences you've had about these things correctly? Have those spiritual experiences come from the right source? All of those things could be at play in your experience. And I don't really think we need to get any more specific than that, because we're trying to speak to a general audience here.
Yep. So there's the 3 poisons.
Yeah, 3 poisons. Consider them in your own life.
Yep.
Here's a nice quote from Jon Kabat-Zinn, one of the great pioneers in mindfulness, which is Buddhism for non-Buddhists. I don't know, it's a way to think about mindfulness, though it is a clinically validated mental health modality right now. The only way to free yourself from a lifetime of being tyrannized by your own thought processes, whether you suffer from excessive anxiety or not, is to come to see your thoughts for what they are, and to discern the sometimes subtle, but most often not so subtle, seeds of craving and aversion, of greed and hatred at work within them, at work within your thoughts. When you can successfully step back and see that you are not your thoughts and feelings, this is so important. You are not your thoughts and feelings, just like you are not your sexuality, that you do not have to believe them, and that you certainly do not have to act on them. When you see vividly that many of them are inaccurate, judgmental, and fundamentally greedy or aversive, you will have found the key to understanding why you feel so much fear and anxiety.
It's a powerful quote. And it's a lot. It's shocking for a lot of people who've never had exposure to mindfulness teachings to hear, wait, I'm not my thoughts and feelings? I thought those were me. Nope.
And then sometimes they will fall in another trap, which is, oh, if I do this, are you saying I'll get rid of all my anxiety ever? No, because then you'd be falling into another attachment.
Yes. Yes.
It's a paradox. I don't know that we've talked in this series, Dan, about how Scott Peck says heresy is an inability to accept a paradox. The paradox, as this teaching relates to mental health, is acceptance of your anxiety may and probably will reduce your anxiety, but that's not why you do it.
Yeah. Right.
You do it because it's a better way to live.
Yep.
And in living that way, you probably will find moments you experience less anxiety. But even if you don't, when you're experiencing the anxiety you do experience, you do it in a healthier way.
Yep.
Which a lot of people who are averse to feeling anxiety will wait, that's not good enough. You have to tell me how to get rid of this. Just like I deal with sexual minorities who will say, you have to help me get rid of these gay feelings. You have to get me rid of this homosexuality. I can't live anymore like this. And we say, well, let's be open and curious and let's see if these shift. And like, are you saying they'll shift, Jeff? No, I'm not. I can't make you that promise. I don't know. But I am saying if you live in a more open, curious way where you see your life as an adventure of exploration and discovery, that is a happier way to live, no matter what happens.
Right.
Right. Okay, we'll keep reading this because even though you didn't underline it, this part's still good. At the same time, you will have found the key to maintaining your equilibrium. Amen, brother. Equilibrium. That's what we're after. Not being straight or being gay or whatever, or being anxious or not anxious. Fear, panic, and anxiety will no longer be uncontrollable demons. Instead, you will see them as natural mental states that can be worked with and accepted just like any others. These aren't some huge things that have to be huge things. They're part of your experience for sure, especially for now. But then, lo and behold, the demons may not come around and bother you so much. May not. Right. You may find that you don't see them at all for long stretches. You may wonder where they went, or even whether they even ever existed. Occasionally, you may see some smoke, just enough to remind you that the lair of the dragon is still occupied, that fear is a natural part of living, but not something you have to be afraid of or debilitatingly afraid of.
Right.
Because fear can still be there, and some things we should be afraid of in life because they're going to harm us. But that doesn't mean we have to collapse into fear.
Right.
So John Kabat-Zinn also has some great things to say about acceptance. So you want to read this one, Dan?
Yeah. Yeah. He says, acceptance does not mean that you have to like everything or that you have to take a passive attitude toward everything and abandon your principles and values. It does not mean that you are satisfied with things as they are, or that you are resigned to tolerating things as they have to be. It does not mean that you should stop trying to break free of your self-destructive habits, or give up on your desire to change and grow, or that you should tolerate injustice, for instance, or avoid getting involved in changing the world around you because it is the way it is and therefore hopeless. It has nothing to do with passive resignation. Acceptance, as we are speaking of it, simply means that sooner or later, you have come around to a willingness to see things as they are. Okay? This attitude sets the stage for acting appropriately in your life, no matter what is happening. You are much more likely to know what to do and have the inner conviction to act when you have a clear picture of what is actually happening, versus when your vision is clouded by your mind's self-serving judgments and desires or its fears and prejudices. All right.
And I love you underlined things as they are, right? That is, in the Doctrine and Covenants, that's 1/3 of the definition of truth. So this acceptance of reality, acceptance of truth. Jesus said, you shall know the truth and it'll set you free. And in the Jeff Bennion translation, that says, and it might hurt like hell.
Yeah, absolutely. Even in the Book of Mormon, I think it was Jacob who said that the Spirit teaches things as they really are. Mm-hmm. This is what we're talking about here is so hard to do. And we employ so many mechanisms to avoid doing it because it involves grieving our delusions, right?
And it's okay to grieve them. In fact, it's necessary too.
Yeah. It's a very important concept and it's very difficult to do.
Tara Brach is another famous modern teacher of mindfulness. The wing of clear seeing is often described in Buddhist practice as mindfulness. Again, she's rolling right into this thing about seeing things as they really are. Clear seeing. And it's a wing because it's a way of achieving flight. The quality of awareness that recognizes exactly what is happening in our moment-to-moment experience, which we pull ourselves away from in all kinds of ways. So as she says, when we are mindful of fear, for instance, we are aware that our thoughts are racing, that our body feels tight and shaky, and that we feel compelled to flee. That is all part of our reality. right? And therefore we recognize all this without trying to manage that control, that need to control, manage our experience in any way without pulling away. Our attentive presence is unconditional and open. We are willing to be with whatever arises, even if we wish the pain would end, which is perfectly acceptable to wish that, or that we could be doing something else. That wish and that thought also become part of what we are accepting, because we're not tampering with our experience. Mindfulness allows us to see life as it is. This recognition of the truth of our experience is intrinsic to radical acceptance. We can't honestly accept an experience unless we see clearly what we're accepting. Just look at the verbiage she's using in this contrast. Manipulate, manage, control, openness, attentive, acceptance, seeing clearly, truth, reality. Just notice, you can almost feel your way into mindfulness by listening to these words versus these words. Dan, why don't you give us the second paragraph here of Tara's?
Okay. So she says, the second wing of radical acceptance, compassion, is our capacity to relate in a tender and sympathetic way to what we perceive. Instead of resisting our feelings of fear or grief, we embrace our pain with the kindness of a mother holding her child. Rather than judging or indulging our desire for attention or chocolate or sex, we regard our grasping with gentleness and care. Compassion honors our experience. It allows us to be intimate with the life of this moment as it is. Compassion makes our acceptance wholehearted and complete. I mentioned before that when I'm talking with somebody who's struggling in their faith, I hope that people, arrive at the point where they can make an honest statement about their present reality, and maybe even tearfully do that with some grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason I hope people can do that is so that they can feel self-compassion and the compassion of others and the compassion of Christ toward them in that moment, and not get this, these judgmental reactions and grasping and those kinds of things like she mentions. And if we are grasping and we have tension about, our resistance to reality, she says we can regard even that with gentleness and care,
mm-hmm.
right? So if you are indulging the three poisons, you don't need to hate yourself for indulging the three poisons. Just notice it.
Accept it and notice it.
Notice
and honor that part of our experience too.
Right. So anyway, I think this is a great quote.
Again, so in our proving contraries, looking at contrasts, here are some contrasts between sort of our natural man responses versus acceptance.
Right.
So we are going to experience injustice, and the natural response is to go into a denial. Maybe, things aren't that bad, whatever. Or I can imagine a world where there's never any injustice anywhere, a world in mortality that's like that. And acceptance says, well, we're going to meet injustice with hope, with service, with persuasion, recognizing we can work to a more just place.
Yep.
Rather than those absolutes. We experience discomfort, and we can respond to that with denial again, numbing, avoidance, fantasy. And acceptance will say we can acknowledge our discomfort, we can be patient, we can endure. We deal with a lot of ambiguity here, where what we don't know is always greater than what we do know.
Right.
And we can go into partisanship. So certainties of my tribe.
Right.
There's false comfort and false reassurance in those certitudes. And that's why they have so much appeal. Or we can project, we can put that ambiguity on others because we won't see it in ourselves. We can respond to ambiguity with openness, with honesty, with charity, with curiosity.
Yep.
I would add curiosity. We're going to face conflict, internal conflict and external conflict. And we can respond to those internally or externally with our own authoritarianism, retreat and avoidance, dehumanizing those parts within ourselves or others. Acceptance says we use and practice loving engagement, respect, again, of those parts of ourselves or others. And then we seek to transcend the conflict, that maybe there's a third way that doesn't have a winner and a loser, but maybe both sides can win. That's the theme of, if there's a theme of this part, it's transcendence.
Yep.
I combined uncertainty with ambiguity in my discussion. But again, with that uncertainty, we can have anxiety, obsession, overwork. I've got to find the answer. I love learning and I love seeing what other people say about things and learning from others. But there's times in my life I've thought, that this is a puzzle to solve. All right, if I can just figure this out, then I'll be okay.
And you can get frantic.
I get frantic about that.
Right.
Yeah. Somebody has the answer here and I'm going to find it and I got to find it quickly. Yep. So that I've overworked myself. I've been obsessed and I've been anxious about that, resolving that uncertainty. But if we go into that with faith, Joseph Smith in the Grove, a constructive action, he took some steps. We can take steps. We can act on what we do know and ask yourself what you do know and what you can do. Are there areas I can act here, even as I don't know what to do and here, and here? Well, what can I do? And just shifting that focus will help us transcend. Notice, as you're pointing out here, Dan, you could point out that it is empowering to go to this mindful place. People that haven't practiced it can think it sounds passive. And what would you say to that?
I strongly disagree. Mindfulness is, when you have these natural gut reactions, these typical kind of programmed reactions to things that we see in the natural response column. If you're mindful, you can be aware, hey, I see this natural reaction. I see its normal tendency to come up in this situation. Now, I also have values and I have aspirations and I have principles. And I can see that I have a choice here between these natural responses or acceptance, which is a much more honest, but often a lot more difficult response to things than our natural reactions. And this is a struggle for me. It's a struggle. The fact that we understand mindfulness doesn't mean we don't struggle with this.
No,
right?
No. If somebody says they're practicing mindfulness perfectly, then they're not.
They're not.
You need to run away and get somebody else to teach you mindfulness than that person.
Right.
I think Jesus is a model of this in several different places for others as well as himself. We talk about him casting the money changers out. And it's easy to miss in the scriptures, but it says he made, what's the exact language? He made a flail. He braided this whip. Well, you don't do that in 10 seconds.
Right.
He saw something, an injustice or some desecration of his father's house. And then he decided to do something. That was not on blind rage that he engaged in there. And there's freedom. There's freedom when we go to that acceptance place, that active choices that you've been talking about, Dan. There's freedom there. That's where we act and are not acted upon. That column is being acted upon. Action and freedom is the others. Another example is when Lazarus dies. For some reason, text doesn't say why, Jesus waits. He's not that far away when he gets word Lazarus is sick, but he doesn't come for 3 days, probably to perform a miracle for his dear friends. But despite that, Jesus knows what he's going to do. And yet it still says Jesus wept.
Yeah.
Because the present reality of Mary and Martha, and likely the whole community of Lazarus, is that they're in grief. And Jesus does not rob them of their grief. He weeps with them.
Right.
He engages in them with their present reality. And then, of course, he transforms it, which is so wonderful. But, I think it's so easy to read that scene and go, well, just tell him, don't cry anymore. Your brother's going to rise from the dead.
That's
He
what I would do.
weeps with them, right? That's what I do too.
Yeah. I'd be like, hey, everybody, quiet
Get over
down.
it. Yeah.
Quiet down.
Quiet down. We're going to just hold on a minute here.
We're all good.
Yeah. He doesn't do that. Why? There's a beautiful moment. Your suffering matters to Jesus. Your present reality, even though he can and I believe will transform it.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, your present reality matters, and he will go there with you.
Yep.
He will enter into that, whatever it is. It's grief or sorrow or loss or discomfort, just whatever it is, he will go there with you. That's what that scene tells me. He will go there with you.
Yep.
There's also, we need to recognize that this is a process. Acceptance is a process. That means things that might be developmentally appropriate at some stages might be limiting at other stages. And I've said a few times, I don't want to be the language police, even as I have been highly critical of the worldly construct of the gay identity. I think it can be harmful and can be limited, but it can also be an important developmental stage in acceptance. For many people, when they say, I am gay, this is why we shouldn't just immediately and reflexively and reactively, right? Attachment, we can go into any of these natural responses when people say that to us or say it to ourselves. We can go to some of these natural responses, but we can step back and say, can this be an important stage in this person's experience of getting over shame, of their acceptance of their present reality, which is they have a same-sex erotic arousal template right now. That's if this saying identifying as gay is part of that process of acceptance, then it's healthy. So that may be what it denotes. Even as I would also suggest an even better way will eventually be this is part of my experience right now.
Yeah. God
made me gay. That is another one that I push back on in this presentation, just ideologically. But when dealing and ministering to the person, we don't, again, want to be reactive to that statement, and we can probe and get underneath of it. And often that can be a place of saying, I'm just accepting what it is. I don't need to blame my parents or blame my genes or blame chemistry or whatever. It's an acceptance that this is my reality. That person might be saying or getting closer to the eventual acceptance that you see there on the far right of this table. This might be moving towards them. So in the ways we might challenge this or be tempted to challenge this, we might be thwarting their developmental process of acceptance and ironically push them back into, or ourselves back into, a non-mindful way of approaching this.
Right.
Even as I believe it's a more accepting and more correct way to say it is, I trust God is with me in this, right? We talked about the man born blind earlier in this part. These experiences I'm having are made to bring glory to God. They are made so that the works of God can be manifest through me and these experiences. God is in this with me.
Yeah. So, and this is applicable to other things too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
When I was 17 and my mom died of cancer, we had a lot of people say, "Oh, God needs her on the other side," and God gave her this, so that she would be a blessing to others, or God did, and I get that there might be something useful in a sense to believing those kinds of things, in the sense that, it can be kind of emotional pain relief.
But they were deployed in this middle column here. I'm flipping back a slide. It's how those things, which may have been true,
Yeah.
But they were deployed as a way to avoid acceptance, weren't they?
Right. Right.
And your grief, avoid experiencing grief.
Yeah. But there's something just amazing about arriving at the point where you say, I don't need an explanation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to say this or that about God's involvement in the cause of this thing I'm experiencing, because I trust God so much. I don't care about cause. I don't care about anything like that. I just feel him with me right now, walking through this and facing it honestly. That's an incredible place to be.
I'm going to use a platitude. Acceptance is not a platitude, even though that is itself a platitude. But God needed her more. She was too righteous for this world. There are all kinds of things you could say. And in fact, people do say those things as they've come to acceptance. So acceptance can sound like a platitude,
right?
But acceptance cannot be created through a platitude. My father, he dealt with some real difficult financial challenges, and he was stressed a lot. I noticed it. He was stressed a lot when he was home. And I asked him years later, I noticed, even as a kid, I noticed a huge shift in him. And he said, I said, how did that happen? He said, I just realized it wasn't worth worrying about. Well, I'm pretty confident if someone would go back in time and just say to my dad, this isn't worth worrying about, that wouldn't get him to acceptance. Right. But the realization, that process of coming to that realization, which at the end of sounds like a platitude, can short circuit, right? Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. That's great if you can do it. But if someone just says that to you, that may not facilitate acceptance.
Right.
Well, we're going to finish this whole thing up with Thomas Keating. You'll never go wrong finishing with Thomas Keating.
Right.
You want to start this one, Dan?
Yeah. He says, as we become more aware of the dynamics of our unconscious, and when we talk about unconscious, we're talking about deep parts of ourselves that we don't really understand, right? Mm-hmm. He said, we can receive people and events as they are, rather than filtered through what we would like them to be, expect them to be, or demand them to be. We need to stop right there. I'm going to read that again. We can receive people and events, and I'm also going to say people and institutions like the church as they are, rather than filtered through what we would like them to be, expect them to be, or demand them to be. Okay?
Church leaders, not just the institutional church. Yes.
Yeah.
And God himself. We will fall into idolatry if we cannot do that with God.
Oh, goodness. That is 100% true. And he says this requires letting go of the attachments, aversions, shoulds, and demands on others and on life that reflect the mentality of a child rather than that of a grown-up. This is a big project, but it is not yet spiritual maturity. It is just human growth into full, responsible, self-reflective consciousness. It is the first step that the gospel invites us to take in the process of repentance. Wow. Repentance, he's framing it as part of this letting go of our delusions and our illusions about what reality should be and how people should be and institutions and everything else. He's saying that's part of repentance, is just sitting with reality as it is. And he says, God approaches us from many different perspectives: illness, misfortune, bankruptcy, divorce proceedings, rejection, inner trials. God has not promised to take away our trials, but to help us to change our attitudes toward them. That is what holiness really is. In this life, happiness is rooted in our basic attitude toward reality. Very, very profound statement here. So think about what he's saying here God has not promised to take away our trials, but to help us to change our attitudes toward them. And mindfulness teachers, and well, I would say Buddhist teachers, talk about how much we are limited when we identify. Okay, we identify with our thoughts, we identify with our feelings, we identify with our desires, we make those into identity. God cannot change our attitudes toward difficult things in our lives if we are identified. If we are saying, this is who and what I am, right? He can't help us to see it in a new light.
God will not overrule our agency, and that is a choice.
Right, right. And that's why questions around identity are so important. Because if you are identified, that means you've built this person out of your thoughts and feelings and desires and expectations and delusions. Nobody can reach you, including God, because you're saying, hey, this is who I am, right?
Yeah, and you're in hell. That is hell.
That is a fantastic definition of hell. It's a way to be just completely miserable, right? So very, very powerful concepts here.
Yeah. Well, we've already covered so much, everybody, but I hope you'll join us for part 4, which is this part 3 was directed. Really, I hope everybody will benefit from this personally. But part 4, we'll talk about ideas for how to approach people at different aspects of their experience, how to minister in a gospel-grounded way to sexual minorities. If you have a loved one, if you're a church leader, if you're ministering brother and sister, you have a friend who's a sexual minority, you'll want to watch part 4.